You're listening to the Ag Policy Connection, brought to you by Real Agriculture in partnership with the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. We're connecting the dots between the people and the policies that shape agriculture and farming today and into the future.
When it comes to agriculture and environmental policy, it often feels like there are two camps or schools of thought. On one hand, you have people who advocate for agriculture that say it is already quite sustainable and that it's a solution to climate challenges and environmental issues that we see today. On the other hand, you have people who want to blame modern farming, that say it's a problem that needs to be changed. And that's where you can also get into the debate over carrots versus sticks, incentives versus penalties. What's the best way to make farming even more sustainable? And in politics, as in other parts of life, you can often have people from both these camps in the same room disagreeing on what the best way is forward. And that's what we're going to be talking about as part of this episode. We want to welcome you once again to the Ag Policy Connection podcast, brought to you by Real Agriculture and the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, or CAPI, as we're going to focus on the politics and the future of sustainability and environmental programs for farms across Canada going forward. I'm Kelvin Hepner, and it's an honor to welcome in today's panelists for this episode, as it's in today's political environment, I'd say it's refreshing that we can bring this group of guests together. First up, we're pleased to have Cody Blois. Cody is the chair of the House of Commons Agriculture Committee in Ottawa. He's also the Liberal MP for Kings Hants in Nova Scotia. Next up, we have John Barlow. John is the Shadow Minister for Agriculture with the Conservative Party of Canada, Member of Parliament for Foothills, Alberta. And rounding out our panel, Alistair McGregor. Alistair is the NDP New Democrat agriculture critic, Member of Parliament from Vancouver Island, BC. And so without further ado, here's our discussion about the politics and the future of sustainability programs in policy in Canada. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us for this conversation.
Thanks for bringing us together, Kelvin.
Thank you.
Cody, why don't we start with you when it comes to that idea of agriculture being part of the solution versus being a part of a problem when it comes to the environment and our country's environmental track record. Where do you stand on that spectrum?
Well, look, I think you'll find that all three of us on this call, and broadly those that are close to the agriculture sector, have some semblance of this in their constituencies or through their parliamentary work, are going to highlight the fact that agriculture is part of the solution. Absolutely. And there's really good work happening across the country. Obviously, the conversation we're going to talk about today is there is tension points, and it's not just the agriculture industry. When you talk about environmental progress, we could lather this in on a forestry conversation. It could be on major industry and how you find a balance between competitiveness for Canadian steel, for example, in a world where increasingly there's a focus on reducing emissions and sustainability writ large. I think an important question you have to start with is how do we define sustainability? And that can mean different things to different folks. But no, absolutely, agriculture across the country is doing some really innovative stuff. It's how we've been able to grow our output over the last 20 or 30 years and be able to hold emissions or even decline slightly in the sector. That wouldn't have been able to happen without the good innovation that's happening. I think the question becomes, how does government incentivize that? How do we work with the sector to make sure that they're set up for success, not only on farm, but also in a global context? Because we know Canadian agriculture, our farmers aren't just feeding Canadians, we're feeding the world. And so how do we play into those global conversations is, I guess, what would be the starting point. And I look forward to the conversation today.
Yeah. John, Cody just mentioned that definition of sustainability. I know this is one of these frequently used words these days that is difficult to define. And of course, financial sustainability is part of this conversation as well. But I think we do want to focus on the environmental side of things and where government policy is headed on that front. What do you see as agriculture's place in terms of a solution versus a problem for the environment?
Well, Kelvin, I think you touched on an important point of any of this discussion that we have on
on the environmental sustainability of agriculture is they can't be environmentally sustainable unless they're economically viable. And I would argue that right now, farmers are getting way too much of the stick and not enough of the carrot, which is putting their economic viability at risk and hampering their ability to reinvest in their operations to ensure that they are able to, adopt that new innovation, purchase that new machinery, take those risks with new ideas and new technology. When they don't have that financial flexibility to do those types of things, which they have done for decades, and the stats clearly play that out, that indeed agriculture is not the problem, it is a critical part of the solution. When you see, just for example, the recent report from the Global Institute on Food Security that showed, a ton of wheat grown in Saskatchewan has 67% less of a carbon footprint than wheat grown anywhere else in the world. Those are showing the incredible steps. Well, incredible might be an understatement when you see just how more sustainable Canadian agriculture has become. And a stat that I like to use a lot when discussing this, especially with those folks who maybe don't understand the gold standard that Canadian agriculture has already met. Traditionally, agriculture in other parts of the world is about 28% of that country's emissions. In Canada, that is 8%. 8% of Canada's emissions come from agriculture. That is 2/3 lower than anywhere else in the world. We haven't done that because we've been punished with a carbon tax or new regulations or those types of things. We've done that because it's the right thing to do. And I think when we talk about the carrot and the stick, I think where the frustration is coming from farmers and ranchers is they aren't being lauded for the work that they've already done. Instead, they are being punished with these sticks to try and get them to somewhere where they're more than willing to get to if we just provide those incentives and in many cases allow them to unleash those opportunities. But when you can continue to burden them with new regulations and financial instability with carbon taxes, higher inflation rates and interest rates, which we don't talk enough about. We don't talk enough, I don't think, about the impact of the higher interest rates are having on agriculture. It's making it difficult. So I think we are at a crossroads where we have to make a decision here on whether we look at agriculture as the solution or continue to treat it as the problem.
I know I complimented you guys on you're showing up and having this nonpartisan discussion, but you don't all have to agree on everything.
I'll have a rebuttal then at some point, Calvin, on some of that. I'll acknowledge some of John's point, and then, but go ahead, Alistair.
Sure, I'll let Alistair comment on this question first. Go ahead, Alistair.
Yeah, I think, the carrot and the stick. Sticks really only work effectively when there's a viable alternative to push people to, right? That's what a price signal is meant to show. And I think the problem in today's environment, if you look at the price signal on oil and gas, like with things like a carbon tax, is it's kind of being drowned out by the fact that oil and gas prices on their own have shot up. Like if you look at the profits in the oil and gas sector, we know from publicly available data that since like in the period from 2019 to 2023 approximately, those net profits went up by over 1,000%. If you look at like the existing federal Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act, you can already see there are carve-outs there for farm fuels, farm machinery, and farm activities. And that's part of the reason why I lend my support to Bill C-234, because I think that bill is written in the spirit that the original Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act was written in. Those are obviously natural gas and propane being used for viable farming activities. So again, I listen to the farmers who come before our committee. They are definitely the ones who are telling us they are on the front lines of climate change. That climate change is being driven by carbon emissions. So we all have a responsibility to try and do our part. But again, farmers are always driving the point at our committee is that they want to see commercially viable alternatives to be able to switch to, because they will do them. They've been doing it on their own. And on the carrot approach, absolutely. Like I'm always wary of talking to an agricultural audience about policy in Ottawa because farmers are very wary of an Ottawa knows best approach. So, in the 6 years that I've had the incredible fortune of being on this committee, I've always tried to seek out those farmers who are the pioneers, the ones who are really pushing the envelope in terms of sustainable practices, different technologies they're employing, because I know other farmers will much more likely listen to them than they will to me as a politician. So it's really just trying to show the incredible innovation and talent that our country has in spades. It's just some sectors or some regions of the country may not be aware of it. So I think that's the role you'll see a lot of parliamentarians around our committee play.
Now, Cody, your government, for example, and I don't mean to pick on you just because your party has been in power here the last number of years. You've brought in, for example, the OFCAF program, the On-Farm Climate Action Fund, which is an incentive type program, I would say, a carrot type program. But at the same time, there is the carbon tax has already been mentioned here as well, which would be more of a stick approach. Some other jurisdictions, you look to the EU and they've introduced cross compliance. There's environmental criteria when it comes to participation or accessing government support in a lot of areas. Would you see a place for those sticks being implemented here in Canada?
Well, I want to go back to the point that you made, and I think Alistair was right in highlighting that the government in 2018, when pollution pricing was established, there was some thought given to making sure that agriculture was exempted by and large. Now, I think there was areas that missed. All three of us on this call have voted for 234, and I think it raises an important point of when that's going to get back to the House. I've kind of chided with Don a little bit. I know the bill is actually in the name of Ben Lobb from Huron Bruce, but the Conservatives do have an opportunity to be able to have more relief for farmers. At least, at the very least, it looks like a parliamentary majority with the Bloc supporting the amended bill. I would like to see a majority from the House. The government's position has been, whether it's through C8, which there is a relative return back. I think the challenge that all three of us would acknowledge on this call is that it's not proportional to who actually pays on propane and natural gas. And the other piece being that, of course, in the budget, there is an announcement of a further return of small business, which farmers will be eligible for. The criteria is not quite out. I know it's something I'll be focused on pushing the government to make sure that those are in place. But there is mechanisms to return it. And I do hope that maybe that's something John can touch on, is when we might see 234 come to a vote, because I would be eager to see at least what can be supported in the House get through. On offset protocols and financial supports, we kind of talk broadly about carrot and stick. This government has put billions of dollars on the table to help support farmers. It's a big industry. And of course, we could always want to do more. John and I were just in the United States to meet with congressional leaderships around issues around agricultural trade. I mean, the Americans, through the Inflation Reduction Act, have truly put billions and billions on the table, but they also have a fiscal capacity to do things that many other countries just simply don't have the ability to do. So I think we would all agree on this call what else can be done to further help support and put incentives in place. But as it relates to some of the sticks, largely they're exempted from agriculture. I think there's more that can be done if Ben Lobb brings that bill forward and the Conservatives bring it forward. And then I think we also have to ask ourselves the question around carbon border adjustment mechanisms. And then what does that mean in a future if the world starts to account for this in a different way? We don't want to put Canadian farmers at a disadvantage. I'm not saying that that would necessarily be the case, because we are sustainable, but we have to make sure that as part of those trading relationships, we're not putting farmers, as a result of removing the carbon price, not putting them at a disadvantage on tariffs in a trading relationship.
Don, I'll let you jump in if you want on C234, but also just this idea of ensuring that Canadian farmers remain competitive, as Cody has alluded to on the trade front, and also as jurisdictions like the EU trading partners implement carbon border adjustments, what the role is for government in fostering and ensuring that Canadian farmers remain competitive.
Yeah, I think that's a huge question, Calvin, is how do we ensure that our farmers do remain not only competitive here in Canada, but around the world? And to do that, they need a competitive tax and regulatory regime that ensures that their financial stability. And, you mentioned the On-Farm Climate Action Fund. That the challenge with that is, well, it's not in this year's budget, so I don't think this is an ongoing program. I think it's now over. So now one of those carrots that was there is no longer there. But that only benefited, again, you're picking winners and losers. Some farmers got it, some didn't. But every farmer is impacted by the carbon tax. And there's no measurement, and the government has admitted this, that they are not measuring emissions reductions from the On-Farm Climate Action Fund or from the carbon tax. So how are we able to justify programs that aren't actually being measured to ensure that they're being, there's some gain for the pain? In terms of 234, I'll just jump on that first, and I appreciate Cody's support on that and Alistair's. But my argument, I guess, would be, okay, you've got C8, you've now said in the budget there's going to be some other things. Why make it so complicated? Why not just approve, so get the Liberals and everyone in the House, as we have done in other things we know are to benefit for all Canadians? Just support 234 in its original form, and all of these other programs are no longer needed, and that complicated paperwork is no longer needed for farmers. 234 right now is gutted. It does not support the heating and cooling of barns or greenhouses, and I was not elected to pass incomplete or bad legislation. Our farmers know that this is not what they need. And we're not here to just provide a little bit of support. As Alistair so well put, 234 was brought forward in the best of spirits, in that we saw that this was an oversight in the original pricing pollution legislation that they didn't understand, or whoever was writing it just did not see that natural gas and propane were critical on farm. And we just wanted to expand that exemption to include all farm fuels. And we still stand by that. We've worked on this for I think we're getting close to 6 years here, and we've been close, and we're close again. But I guess my counter to Cody in all truthfulness would be just support 234 in its original form. We don't need C8. We don't need additional top-ups in the budget. Just don't pay the tax initially, and then you don't need that rebate. That would be my counter to that.
Does that impact Canada's status when it comes to carbon border adjustments, though, John, on trade with the EU?
Well, I think with our trade with the EU, and we've also discussed this at our committee, is EU is always going to be a trade challenge. Look what's going on right now with our beef and pork, with durum wheat, for example. The EU is always going to find a way to throw up a non-tariff trade barrier or some sort of mechanism to block Canadian agriculture products going into the EU. And we're having the same challenge with the United Kingdom now that they've, through Brexit, have left the EU. So I think there has to be, and the problem with the carbon border adjustments is if there is a challenge there, the first target for our trading friends, whether that's the United States or the EU, is always agriculture. So we have to be very cognizant of that. Then we are putting up these new policies and new regulations that they are going to be in line with what our trading partners are doing. But we also have to push back. There has to be a pushback from us in Parliament when countries like or groups like the EU put up these very selective non-tariff trade barriers that are not based on science, that are not based on good trade relationships. And I think that's all of us on this call would agree with that there has to be some pushback from all of us when those types of impediments are put up to Canadian agricultural products.
So, Alistair, John mentioned before that farmers would like to be recognized for what they're already doing when it comes to sustainability practices, and this is potentially an issue. Again, we've mentioned carbon border adjustments. We also have more companies, food companies in particular, looking at Scope 3 emissions reporting and requiring traceability and tracking of stuff along those lines. What do you see as the role for government in ensuring that sustainability practices at the farm are properly accounted for and recognized and valued when it comes to returns to the farm gate?
It's a great question because I think there's a disconnect between what kind of farming practices are going on and many of the consumers who are ultimately at the end point buying the food. And I think both government and the agricultural industry as a whole, through the various component organizations, be it the CFA or the various different farm organizations for different crop sectors, I think we have a role to play to try and really sing the praises of what agriculture is doing, like recognize the unique partnerships. Like, for example, the Canadian Cattle Association is partnering up with environmental organizations to recognize the intrinsic relationship between Canada's grasslands and large herbivores. The reason why the prairies were such a great place and still are is because they have that symbiotic relationship with large herbivores. And similarly, if a lot of the Western farmers in particular, because of the no-till practices that have been largely adopted, the fact that through the right application of fertilizer, new seeding technologies mean less passes of the tractor going over the same field. Those have real measurable impacts, not only on the fuel that's consumed on the farm, but also the relevant emissions. And I think like also underpinning all of this is that there's a greater need for data too. We need to really measure, in different farming practices that are employed in all parts of Canada, how much carbon is being sequestered in those soils. What positive role is agriculture playing in being part of the solution? And here's the measurable impact. And I think, I've always tried to, sing the praises of building local resiliency as well. I think if you ask any members in our respective communities, they want to have a role in supporting local agriculture. Like in the Cowichan Valley, where I'm from on Vancouver Island, I'm lucky to come from a place that has a long and storied history in agriculture. We've got multi-generational farms there, but the people who live in the Cowichan Valley want to buy Cowichan farm products. So if we can find a way to shorten the food distance, support those local economies, I think that's all the more better in singing the praises for the great work that agriculture as a whole is doing.
Okay. You just brought up something there, Alistair, in terms of that local geographic regionality that I think is an issue when it comes to program creation across Canada and implementation of a lot of these policies. Cody, when it comes to implementing these sustainability programs, is it possible in Canada to do it in a way that is not overly complex, in a way that incentives are easily understood at the farm level from your riding in Kings Hants, which also has multi-generation farm family businesses, just like Alistair's and John's? How do we make these types of programs and incentives in the future fair and equally accessible across the country?
So look, there's different approaches about how you could go to it. If you're sitting in Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada or one of the departments that would be creating these programs, you still need to try to make sure that the money that is being allocated in program dollars is resulting in some type of outcome. So there's always that tension between how wide do you make a program in terms of the scope of how the money is allocated versus the actual outcomes of what you would be expecting the recipients to actually provide. I think in some ways, Kelvin, this is already accomplished through the SCAP, the fact that we have provincial, territorial, and Government of Canada dollars that are going specifically to projects where provincial governments can then allocate based on their regionality. I think that there is interesting nuances. We talk about soil complexity. It is different in Western Canada than it is in Eastern Canada. I think we're trying to find that sweet spot, but it's not always easy in terms of how that plays out. So I know one of the things we wanted to talk about was offset protocols. We have a methane one that has now been developed. Soil is the next one that's coming along. I think the more flexibility and trying to bring people into the tent is better than being too narrow. But at the same time, there is limited and finite resources in terms of how we reward at the same time. The one point I do want to talk about, though, is a lot of this is focused on government policy, as rightfully should. We're three members of parliament here, but I think we need to at least talk a little bit about the way in which major corporations are also steering outcomes on farm as well, through their supply chain, through their own environmental and social goals. That is having a major impact as well. And there's major companies that have their own decarbonization goals that are playing into this conversation. I think at some point we have to try to align government policy along with the private sector to try to create a common market about what we're chasing here. Not easy. I don't have a perfect playbook on it, but it's not just government that's talking about these things. Big companies around the world are trying to work with farmers in the supply chain to do some of the things we're talking about here today.
So what does that look like, Cody, or in terms of a vision down the road and having private companies? And you've mentioned the fiscal constraints when it comes to funding some of these incentive type programs. Some of this probably needs to be transferred to the private market in terms of the cost of having some of these incentives at the farm level. What does that look like? Is there a carbon offset or inset market down the road that government needs to step aside and let the market, or just serve as a regulator in terms of quality control and data collection, that type of thing down the road?
I think it's more about trying to align the policy approaches. We actually had this, I don't want to tell tales out of school, but we had Robert Bonney, the undersecretary to USDA, and we frankly asked the same question: how are the Americans approaching this conversation? Because again, they would share the same regionality, complexity in their federated union. And again, there's no perfect answers. And we talked about larger corporate entities. I think it's about government trying to align to the extent possible about what those yardsticks are, what are the parameters of what we're going to identify and what we measure. And then to your point, Kelvin, there is so much more private capital out there. I mean, government is so finite in terms of what we can do to drive transformation. It's going to be the private sector that leans in and helps drive. I do have to put one point, and I want your farmers to know on the budget. John mentioned regulatory and certainly tax competitiveness. One thing that I was very happy to see in the budget is not only some of the programs we talked about on ONCAF and clean agricultural tech programs, which are just continuing on, but is also capital gains. The fact that we are going to be increasing the threshold before farmers actually even pay on capital gains, and the qualified farm businesses that are incorporated are also going to be subject to a lower inclusion rate for the next $2 million, from 1.25 million to 3.25. That's a good win for agriculture because we know the size of the businesses. These are sophisticated businesses. People have worked hard, and we want to make sure that when there is a transfer of assets, that people are not paying as much tax.
I'm guessing John wants to respond on a different part of the capital gains announcement.
Yeah, I think you've, and I appreciate Cody's position there, but I think that's trying to show you one thing in one hand and taking it from the other, because increasing the capital gains tax from 50% to 67% is a massive hit when farmers are selling their farms and their operations, especially when it comes to succession planning. There's no farm that's worth $2 million or $3 million. We're talking about $10 to $20 million operations, and now selling that farm with the capital gains exemption increase. The capital gains increase from 50 to 67%. You could see some farmers now paying $4 million in additional taxes that they were not going to be paying before. So, increasing the capital gains exemption is a win. I will grant that. But then by taking that away, by increasing the capital gains tax to 67% is a massive hit to agriculture. And I think the government's going to be hearing that if they haven't heard that already.
John, I'll just jump in. That's the inclusion rate is increasing, not the actual capital gains.
Yes, thank you.
Full tax. But on the carbon market offset discussion that Cody was just leading to, John, I'd like your opinion as well in terms of how to maximize that value for farmers in terms of we've been hearing for years about the potential for carbon as a revenue stream at the farm level. What do you see as the path forward for that? Putting a value on that emissions reduction that in many cases, and especially for example, in your area in Alberta where farmers have implemented zero till, there are already these practices in place. What do you see that market looking like going forward, and what's the role for government?
Yeah, in Alberta, we also had the carbon credit program that unfortunately was canceled a couple of years ago, and I think that was a good template for us as parliamentarians to take a look at. And Cody was right. We had great conversations in the United States with fellow parliamentarians, their congressmen, as well as the undersecretary, to discuss this very topic. And I think we have an opportunity here to kind of learn some lessons that are going on in other jurisdictions. For example, IndioAg in the United States, which is running a pilot project on carbon credits. Cargill, Nutrien, some others are where the private sector is taking on that role to provide the private sector funding. I think where the government's role would be, as you mentioned, Calvin, is more of a developing that framework, almost being the referee, where you develop what the carbon market is, and then allow the private sector to work, to fund that and to be the active participant in it. I think part of the problem we have now is it's just simply a wild west out there where nobody really understands what the value of a carbon credit is, and that we have to ensure that whatever we develop and whoever the government of the day is that it's not overly complicated, it's not additional paperwork, and you're seeing, no matter who's in government, this isn't a partisan problem, but I think it's a bureaucracy problem, is when you have a program like agri-stability there, where that's supposed to be the flagship business risk management program out there for farmers. But when your enrollment is less than 35%, that should be raising some red flags that there's a problem with this program. It's too complicated. It's onerous paperwork. In many cases, a farmer won't see that payout when he needs it 2 years down the road. We need something that's efficient, that's bankable, that's timely. But as Alistair said, and I think Cody would agree, is one of the things we're missing here is that baseline data of showing where we are in terms of soil health, carbon sequestration. I know AFC has put out a study, showing that agriculture has sequestered 11 million tons of carbon since 2016. But we need something that's really more up to date. And I know Alistair's working very hard with Senator Black on a national soil study, which I think is a great initiative. I don't think, Alistair, correct me if I'm wrong, the last one was done in the mid-'80s type of thing. And I think a lot of that data is there that municipalities have compiled, but there isn't, a central database for all of us to put that there. So I think there's definitely a role for the private sector. I think there's a more key role for the private sector to play. Where the federal government plays a role perhaps would be more of a kind of that referee, where they would build the framework, as I believe the Liberal government is doing right now. So credit where credit is due, and then release that framework out there to give the market some pretty stringent rules around how this is going to work and what the value of the carbon credits would be, to ensure that the farmers are the one that benefit from this and the private sector has some skin in the game.
Kelvin, can I just touch in on...
John alluded... Oh, go ahead, Cody.
I just wanted to touch in on business risk management, because I think John's right. There had been some, farmers will remember the fact that it had gone from an 85% trigger amount, is what is often quoted in my writing, and an 85% compensation amount for any dollars below that threshold. I certainly applaud where the government has moved the compensation amount back up to 80% on agri-stability, and we've removed the reference margin limits from the past cuts of the government. But there's more to be done. We're studying horticulture right now, and I think that when I talk to my farmers in Kings Hants, part of the reason why some of them don't join is because of the diversified nature of their farm. It's very unlikely that they would ever trigger. And I guess some of the counterpoint to that would be, well, look, they're already diversified. That's a mechanism. But it's why they don't join some of these programs on the overall agri-stability, is because that threshold has gone down to 70%, and you would have to have a pretty catastrophic event. Now, we are seeing those events, but I think we can all agree here that we need to continue to rebuild up after the cuts that had happened previously.
So I was going to use business risk management, including agri-stability, as a positive example here of a type of programming that has been relatively stable from a farmer's decision-making perspective. Sure, it is far from perfect, but if I put my farmer's hat on, it's tough to make expensive decisions on government policies and programs that could change with the next federal budget or the next election, which of course is just a year and a half away at max right now. Alistair, when it comes to these types of programs, how do we, or does there need to be some level of election proofing so that there is some stability to these programs and farmers can, like John said, bank on them?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to add a quick bit in about business risk management programs, because the other program that I think is going to be very heavily used is agri insurance over the next bunch of decades, right? I mean, that pays out whenever you have an uncontrollable natural hazard. But as we see the effects of climate change and our farmers being on the front lines, I think that's going to be a program that is going to be very heavily used in the coming decades. And I think, provincial governments and the federal government are probably going to have to look at that, and maybe they're going to have to look at on-farm practices. How well are farmers trying to shore up their operations against those disasters that are coming their way? I think that's going to be a big topic of conversation going forward. But yeah, no, I'm all in favor of election proofing programs. I think, one of the consequences of our system is that we can suffer from policy lurch when it goes from one government to the other. And that can, be good for the party that's assumed the reins of government, but it can be bad for people who are trying to plot a way forward on what types of programs they can really rely on, what's going to be there, or is there going to be a sudden change in direction? Now, I'm glad John mentioned soil health and soil conservation. As many of your listeners may know, this has been a big topic that I've been very passionate about. I introduced a bill C-203, to try and set up a national strategy on soil conservation and soil health. It's modeled after what the Australian government is doing, and I think it's really treating soil as an incredibly important strategic asset. And the way I'm trying to election-proof it, and hopefully this is an example that governments can follow, is by putting in that legislative guardrail of having a national strategy. That means that whatever government comes into effect, there's still going to be this legislative requirement that they report to Parliament on the key components of the strategy that are being followed. It requires that the minister in charge at the federal level is working with their provincial counterparts, is working with agricultural stakeholders. So I think there's always got to be room for whatever government assumes the reins to pursue the ideas that they were elected on. I think that's an important part of our democracy. But I also think there are really important items in the agricultural field which transcend whatever government's in power, and that need to have a longer horizon than the 4 years we're afforded, sometimes less, with minority parliaments. That policy lurch can be more detrimental than beneficial in some instances. So absolutely, there is room for election proofing by putting in those legislative guardrails.
All right. Maybe as a final round of question or topic theme here, Alistair, you mentioned agri-insurance. Farmers would often refer to it as crop insurance, and the sustainability of that going forward in terms of federal and provincial support for those programs if the payouts are increasing in future years. Cody, how do you see that issue unfolding? And are you concerned that, I know on this panel, all three of you are very familiar with agriculture and what happens in agriculture, but not everybody in your parties and in your caucuses is. And are you concerned about whether there will be support for government funding of a program like crop insurance in the future?
Not particular on this issue. I think that there is a long-standing record through the agricultural partnerships of the importance of BRM tools writ large. We're a big federation, provincial and territorial governments play in. I think the big question becomes how much additional funding will you see? So I do give credit to our government. I'm proud of the fact that there was an additional $500 million above and beyond, I think, what would have been a program of at least $3 billion, so about $3.5 billion in the most recent partnership. The question becomes in future years, if there's a desire and a need for even more programming, how far do those limits go? And one of the things we talked about before we came on live was sometimes the divide between urban and rural Canada, and policymakers and MPs who come from big urban constituencies that don't have much semblance of how agriculture works, what the dynamics are on the ground. I think that is probably a bigger question beyond, and it plays into the question around sustainability, which is how do we make sure that the programs, to Alistair's point, that are being cultivated in the government of Canada, regardless of what partisan stripe might be in government, are making sure they're meeting the needs of rural Canada and farmers on the ground. And I think all three of us would agree that there's work to be done on that. And that is not necessarily a partisan issue. That is just the complexities of civil service, understanding the issues on the ground and making sure that what they do come up with is accountable to taxpayers' dollars, but also flexible enough to meet the needs across the country. So we could have a first year university course on this, but I think it's important. And I think the one thing I would want to leave your listeners, and you started the show by saying that the Agriculture Committee is one of the most multi-partisan, and the fact that we work together, and I would say that I'm proud of the culture that we've created. We all have our partisan kind of viewpoints, I'll say. You heard that play out a little bit here today. But I think at the end of the day, the committee members are really focused on agriculture, but there's only so many of us. Like, there are 338 members of parliament. I would hazard to guess that there's maybe a dozen real true champions that are focused. There's other people who have some semblance of agriculture, but we need to make sure that the public is more engaged and that the MPs who come in, we're doing the work so that they understand the industry. This is a $140 billion industry. I know I'm preaching to the choir. That is bigger than the auto industry, for example. It's spread out in a different way, but it is massive from coast to coast. It is important for food security. It's important for national security, and we feed the world, and we should take great pride in that. And I think there's more to be desired, so to speak, about how all of us, all parties, continue to push that message.
So, as somebody, Cody, who has real life experience, I think maybe more than anybody else on this panel, in terms of your party having many representatives from urban parts of Canada, is that disconnect between an understanding of agriculture and the value of agriculture, is that our biggest barrier to effective sustainable ag policy in the future?
I think a little bit. There's always going to be a tension. Let's say the NDP surprise us and they're in government tomorrow. Alistair would be still dealing with this as potentially maybe the ag minister. If the Conservatives were in government tomorrow, there would still be these tensions playing out. So I would take it bigger about the importance of agriculture writ large, beyond the conversation around sustainability. I think that there's more to be done writ large. I think this government actually has some record that is perhaps understated, because we don't have as many MPs to actually tell the story. There are large swaths of this country where we have done some good things, and it's difficult to get the message out because we don't have incumbency. And there are fewer MPs that wear a red jersey or maybe orange that are out being able to tell the story of some of the good things. And maybe we have less voices in the caucus to make sure that in some instances where we don't always get it right, that those are being reflected. But look, I actually think we have a better record than perhaps sometimes our critics give us record for. There's always room for improvement. And I think across party lines, the more that we can continue to promote and drive the industry forward is a good thing. And that's why you have all three of us on here, because we believe in the sector and we want to see good for Canadian agriculture.
How about from your perspective, John, in the Conservative Party? I know we often just assume that the Conservative Party has an understanding of agriculture and rural Canada because of when you look at that electoral map where it is blue. But is that always the case? And do you see this as a barrier to effective sustainable ag policy programs within your party and priorities within your party?
Yeah, I think we all have challenges in our parties and in our caucus, and as Cody said, our ag committee, we are very collegial. We try to work together as best we can, but even on that committee of less than a dozen people, there are different points of view, and you have to work your way through those different points of view, which sometimes is beneficial. It's constructive, but I think not the challenge. I think anyone who is forming government, there would be three things that I would say we would need to focus on. Number one is, as you mentioned, Kelvin, that urban rural divide, but I think it's broader than that, where the role that a federal government can make, regardless of political stripe, is the narrative has to be positive when it comes to dealing with agriculture. Policies and regulation and the narrative that goes around that should be painting agriculture as it truly is, which is, again, right from the beginning, is part of the solution when it comes to affordable, sustainable, and abundant food production, sustainability environmentally, but economically viable as well. Second, you need a cabinet that understands the importance of agriculture not only as an industry, but again as food production, but as importance to our global reputation, to our trade relationships, and certainly to our rural communities. And if you don't have that strong Minister of Agriculture that is going to push back, and I would say we're seeing that now, where you have ECCC, or Environment and Climate Change, driving a lot of the policy, impacting a lot of different departments. Whether that's the carbon tax, the P2 plastics ban, the plastics registry. All of these things are having an impact on agriculture, where it doesn't seem like agriculture's voice is being heard. Thirdly, and I think this is of an overarching issue here, is everything that we're talking about is productivity. Farm Credit Canada did a great report a few months ago that showed that productivity in agriculture is down to about 1% growth annually, where traditionally it's around 2%. If we are able to get agriculture back to that 2% of annual production growth, that's an additional $30 billion in revenue for farmers over the next decade. That's not any new policies, or that's not any new incentives. That's not, throwing money at this project or this project. That is just, in many cases, getting regulations out of the way, getting competitive tax regime. We can't have fertilizer prices up 100%, and allow agriculture to get back to traditional production levels. And that is a massive change in the financial health of Canadian agriculture, just by getting it back to where it was traditionally. So we're talking about all these programs and all these government interventions, where in many cases it's just allowing farmers to do what they've been doing for decades. That's improving yields, improving soil health, embracing new innovation, new technology, to ensure that they can do what they do best, and that is food production, certainly not only to feed Canada, but to feed the world. And I think that's something any government, regardless of your political affiliation, should be embracing. The statistics are there. The solution is there. You just need somebody to grab hold of that and embrace it.
Yeah, that productivity question is something I'm not sure if we're giving Alistair the final word. Cody, do you want to respond on how your government has approached productivity in agriculture? We, of course, have seen a fair bit of discussion over the last while about the emphasis on reducing emissions when it comes to like agricultural research funding. For example, if somebody wants to apply for funding or receive a federal grant, there needs to be an emissions component. Not as much emphasis on productivity as there used to be, even though I think there isn't a sustainability argument for increasing productivity as well. How do you see productivity as a priority in your government?
Look, I would just, John lays out a very clear message about getting rid of regulatory barriers, focusing on innovation. Easy in theory, but a little bit more difficult in practice in terms of what that looks like. What I would say is our government has been focused on working with agriculture. I would agree about the narrative, about the importance. And I would say that our government is of the view that, look, agriculture is extremely important, and you've seen some major investments. During the Harper years, there was no investment in the Canadian Agricultural Partnership in terms of actually growing that as a proportion of funding in relation to the time value of money and inflation. we were actually the ones that reestablished programs on business risk management. We were the ones that have actually put more money back into the agricultural partnership in a significant way, and put a lot of money back into investment in research that drives innovation. Look, a lot of the focus on the Conservative side is around carbon pricing. I think we have opportunities on C234 as a parliament to be able to do something different. The government has an approach that in some ways I support. I actually believe in the concept around carbon pricing, but I was one of the members of parliament that actually fought to get adjustments on the rurality, the higher rural supplement exemptions in certain areas. So look, I think it's easy to set a narrative around innovation. That's important. I completely agree. And the government is focused on this. Sometimes we just don't have as many messengers. So I appreciate the opportunity to come on because we just don't have as many colleagues that represent rural Canada, which is part of the challenge in the government telling its story on some of the good things that are happening.
All right. Alistair, final word to you in terms of what you see as barriers to effective, sustainable ag programs and policy in Canada. Is it this urban-rural divide inside your party? Is that something that you deal with as well, or what do you see as barriers going forward on this area?
Sure. Well, in our small but mighty caucus, I would reckon that about actually half of our MPs come from rural Canada, and so that gives me, as the agriculture critic, a really easy time of it because they understand their communities, they understand what makes rural Canada go, and the importance of agriculture in local economies. But I think to Cody's point, for any party that forms government, you have to grapple with the reality that by and large, most of the ridings fall within urban boundaries. So when you reach a point of critical mass where you have enough seats to form government, be it a minority or a majority, you're still going to be dealing with the issue that most of the MPs in your caucus are most likely going to come from an urban area. And so I think John and Cody both touched on this point, is you have to make sure that within your caucus, you're having those strong conversations, hopefully with a lead minister of agriculture and strong parliamentary secretaries who are driving home the importance. And hopefully that minister is taking the lead on various cabinet committees, especially when you have cross-pollination with other departments, whether it's health or environment or even international trade. I would say, just on the productivity question, broadly speaking, like we measure productivity as a comparison between how many inputs were used to achieve an output. And I think right now, the way I would approach this question from an NDP's perspective is to try and institute some kind of a system of fairness. Because right now, I think if you look at our entire food supply chain, the people who are hurting the most are at opposite ends of that food supply chain. It's the producers who are producing the food. They are dealing with really, really high input costs. If you look at gross farm revenues and you look at the small amount the farmer is able to keep after they've subtracted all their input costs, it's quite small, and they're dealing with very tight margins. We know that farm debt has increased over the last number of decades. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have the consumer who we know through the last couple of years has been dealing with really high food price inflation. Since this is an agricultural podcast, I think the way I would approach this, and I think it would have the beneficial effect of addressing productivity, is by addressing those high input costs. There have been really high costs in fertilizer, in fuel costs, and it just so happens that many of the companies that operate in those sectors are also enjoying really high profit margins right now. So again, if we want to be fair to our farmers and we want to increase their productivity, bringing those input costs down will have the beneficial impact of not only doing their bottom line a lot more justice, but it will also increase Canada's productivity as a beneficial impact.
All right. Well, thank you, all three of you, for joining us on behalf of CAPI and Real Agriculture. Thank you for taking the time to making it. I know you're busy. The House is in session again this week, so thank you for prioritizing the time to discuss this important topic with us. And we certainly know where you stand. We'll now wait to see where your parties stand in the coming months, as of course we move closer to a federal election that is down the road. So, thank you, Alistair, John, Cody, for joining us here on the Ag Policy Connection.